Listen-only mode.
Welcome everybody, welcome to this second webinar of the Beijing+20 Year of Action of the European Women's Lobby. Today is a very special day. It's the International Day of Peace. And I think this webinar will give a clear message that peace is not just about the absence of war, it's about the realization of justice, equality and security for all. And that starts with women and girls, clearly for the European Women's Lobby. This webinar is part of a series of action that we undertake this year in 2015 to celebrate the 20 years of the Beijing Platform for Action. And September is dedicated to women in armed conflict because of the Peace Day. And it's very timely also because of the situation that Europe faces in terms of what some people call the refugee crisis. It's also very timely because it's the 15 years of this United Nations resolution on women, peace and security. So we will have a lot to talk about today. And the goal of the webinar is really to give visibility to the work and the activities of the European Women's Lobby and its members and its partners, and to bring strong recommendations and ideas for the future, and to really bring the feminist perspective. So concretely, we'll have two sections in this webinar, which will be moderated by Una and myself. And technically speaking, you can follow us using the hashtag Beijing20, and don't hesitate to ask questions, to make comments, to give a lot of life to this webinar. So now I give the floor to Una, and she's going to introduce the first section, which is about women's organizations mobilized for peace and security.
Thank you, Pierrette, and good morning, everybody. So in this first section, we'll be hearing from our members about why women's organizations mobilize for peace and security, and to highlight that this is an issue which concerns Europe, with the persistence of conflict preventing the achievement of gender equality and women's rights. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rada Boric, the Director of Women's Studies in Croatia, who will be talking to us about the Women's Tribunal in Sarajevo. Welcome, Rada. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Zagreb. I just returned from one yet new protest to try to assure that refugees coming from Syria and other places would be treated in a decent way. Why, as a women, we organize? Because the Balkans, Croatia, Serbia, and other countries of former Yugoslavia has experienced the war, and women fastly organized to support women refugees, regardless of their ethnicity or their age or their education or their sexual orientation, and we were really very good in it. And of course we were disappointed, while we supported women refugees, that those who were creating the politics of supposedly peace, they didn't ask, or women were not involved in a peace process. As also in the 2000, when Security Council revolution, I wished it was, Resolution 1325 was proposed, it set the key notion of women being really politically active. It means that women have to participate in creating sustainable peace. Why women in the region organize to make an alternative women's court was exactly that 23 years after the conflicts and wars in the Balkans, women didn't achieve any justice. Women didn't demand much, but we all faced that men who participated in war became war veterans. They got all proper protection and military pensions and so forth. But women and civilians, and especially women survivors of sexual violence, that due to the war in the Balkans, the world heard more, although, you know, as we know, that rape was connected with the previous wars, and that women, let's say, that survived sexual violence during the Second World War were not yet compensated. Our idea was to first show the solidarity cross borders, so we made an initiative with women from women's groups from all former Yugoslav countries, and we started the process 4 years ago. It was a really grassroots process. We were hearing what type of justice women would like to see, and this is why our court, which is modeled as already many different so-called people's courts or women courts existed over recent years, our court had the notion of and was called a feminist approach to justice. What this meant? It meant that women would become, and that women really were, the subject of justice. As you know, even The Hague, that started prosecuting rape during the war in Bosnia, also always women were just witnesses, many times were double victimized while being witnesses. What we wanted was that we listened to women, that we listened to their demands, and enable them a space where their experience was heard. For many of them, heard for the first time. We didn't want only to focus to sexual violence during the war. For us, it was also as important to see what was economic violence that happened thanks to the war, immediately after the wars on the Balkans, with the neoliberal tendencies that happened, and privatization of everything that was before socially owned. And for us, it was also important to see how also women activists and people who were struggling to be anti-militarist, how also they suffered the consequences of being different. So the notion of a women's court, I think, was very important. There was more than 500 women that gathered in Sarajevo at the beginning of May this year. We made wonderful recommendations that I hope might start living in our own countries, because one of the ideas of the court was also to influence institutional justice. We were aware that this was out of institutional justice, and women knew that this was our aim to show what we think that justice is, what we think that feminist ethics of care is. But we also wanted to influence our government, and I have to say that recently Croatia adopted a new law on the support of victims of sexual violence, and now it is our task to monitor how the law would be implemented. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Okay, that was a very important presentation. It was really interesting that you said that women hadn't been heard. There was no space for women to be heard, and that it was really just important to listen to these women and to hear what they wanted to say and what they needed after the conflict. So that was really great. Thank you so much. So now I would like to welcome Elizabeth Law, who will discuss the women's role in post-conflict reconstruction in Northern Ireland. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. And I was very struck by Rada at the beginning talking just there about sustainable peace and the importance of that, and that has so many echoes for me. The experience of Northern Ireland was that of a long-term, low-intensity conflict. During it, women were victims and combatants, but they also organised together across a divided society to fight against poverty, for the protection of women, for resources for women experiencing violence or experiencing poverty, and so that they could continue to have education and have the childcare to allow them to take up and access training and employment. During the conflict, the European stage was very important to us as a place where alliances could develop outside of Northern Ireland, and in essence, part of the peace process could grow. The Northern Ireland Women's European Platform, now was set up to bring together women's groups, and eventually became part of the UK coordination to the European Women's Lobby. Meanwhile, in politics, a women's coalition was born which made sure that women's voices were directly heard in negotiations and finally in the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. And that agreement committed to the full and equal participation of women. However, 17 years on, there's been little advancement of this commitment, and an all-party group at Westminster, the UK Parliament, set up an inquiry into the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in Northern Ireland. As Secretariat to the all-party group at the Northern Ireland administration, NIWEP completed this inquiry, taking written and oral evidence from human rights and equality bodies, justice bodies, other public bodies, and of course from women themselves. And the inquiry found that women and men are concerned about gender equality and its status. They're concerned about the lack of resources, the lack of affordable childcare, the continuing poor attitudes and stereotypes. There's frustration about the lack of any real movement towards equal representation in electoral politics, and a feeling that women's voices are silenced and not valued in communities. There's little use of positive action to include women in decision making in general, or in post-conflict reconstruction specifically. We have failed to deal with the legacy of violence and indeed the continuing violence that we see in our community. And today our administration is stalled and in crisis. We have talks beginning today. Mitigating measures on austerity and welfare reform are stalled because they're linked to the need to find a way of dealing with the legacy of the conflict. The Stormont administration says the difficulty in defining rape and sexual crime make it too difficult even to consult on decriminalising abortion. The minister who would take decisions on a violence against women strategy and resources for the domestic violence helpline has stood aside, leaving the post unoccupied while political talks begin today. Last Commissioner for Public Appointments left early because of his frustration with inaction around his recommendations, and local government reform has been completed without gender mainstreaming. NIWEP believes from all our work on women that three factors need to be present for women's equality. We need to see leadership that is unequivocal in working for women's equality and rights. We need to see a visible commitment to gender mainstreaming and positive action at the heart of government's programmes, policies and strategies. And always we need to see women's voices being the focus of our way of finding a way forward. We're working with other women's groups as a project called Women Co to make sure that all of our work is more powerful than simply the sum of its parts, so that our gender strategy reflects the work being done by women to achieve a coordinated, coherent, comprehensive, and that's where Women Co comes from, all of those collective words in order to create an agenda for change in women's representation, against poverty and austerity measures, for women's economic independence, for our reproductive rights, and to secure childcare. We'll do this on an east-west basis with women's groups in England, Scotland and Wales, and on a north-south basis across the island of Ireland with our sisters in the south. In closing, I would just like to leave you with something that was said at a meeting held as our Women's Coalition was being born, and this was before our ceasefires. There were women and some men there from across our communities, and they were speaking of the hard issues that we had to deal with before the ceasefires. And one woman said, no, prisoner release, decommissioning of weapons, these aren't the hard issues. None of us wants to see our men in prison. None of us wants arms and explosives on our streets and in our communities. The hard issues will come when we're talking about childcare and abortion. We hope we're at that point now, and we hope for the things that will change women's lives in our society, and that those things are at the heart of what women's groups here are working for, so that women's voices collectively and comprehensively stir that leadership to deliver the visible commitment that we haven't yet seen, but so that we have the outcome of women's rights and equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for a very engaging discussion. It's an interesting point to highlight that the legacy of violence remains and that violence continues in people's day-to-day experience and for women in their homes. And I really think that reflects with what Rada was saying before about silence and women not being heard. Next, we are very pleased to have Magda Zenon with us from Cyprus to discuss the inclusion of women in peace negotiations in Cyprus. So Magda, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, and this is Magda speaking from Cyprus, from Kruidewom, Cyprus. Thank you for having me here. Interesting discussions by both Rada and Elizabeth that touch on a lot of what is happening in Cyprus. Cyprus has been a divided island since 1974. The recognized South, governed by the Republic of Cyprus government, the unrecognized North, administered by Turkish Cypriots and an army. Over the years, this is 41 years later, we've had peace negotiations happening on and off. We've had UN involvement. The only thing that's been consistent is no women participation, and the public and political discourse has been purely ethnic concerns, purely Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot. Women had no choice but to mobilize, to bring to the fore what it means to be a woman in time of war. This type of advocacy was started off by Hands Across the Divide in 2002. It's a bicommunal, an island-wide women's movement which did a lot of grassroots activity, and then it was followed by the Gender Advisory Team that formed in 2009 that did a lot of research on why women are not present and what is the reason for the failure and how we can include women in the peace negotiations and in the post-conflict implementation. And what was identified was actually quite common sense. Women have never been at the negotiating table. Equality is only interpreted in terms of ethnic equality and not in terms of gender or anything else. And Cyprus, unlike the other two countries, has never really had a women's movement. So in this way, there has never been a unified voice to influence the negotiators. And the other point is that human rights, in terms of right to return, right to find out about your missing, the right to property, has never been addressed in terms of gender. So the Gender Advisory Team, with the assistance of the UN good officers, presented some recommendations that they put together on governance, power sharing, property and economic issues. And these were presented to the leaders and the negotiators, and they were made public. These recommendations and the work of GATT, of which I'm a member, was acknowledged by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in his 2010 report on the mission of good officers in Cyprus. And the leaders and the representatives of the leaders have actually spoken to all of us together and apart about these recommendations, and they've made a semi-commitment to implementing them. But together with those recommendations and the letters that were sent by the European Women's Lobby at the request of the Cyprus Women's Lobby to the two leaders of the communities, to the negotiators, and to the special advisor to the Secretary General, Mr. Ida and Mrs. Wattenheim, a gender equality team, technical team was appointed in June, beginning of June. The problem was that there was no processes, okay? So no one knows how these women, these gender activists or specialists were appointed. There was no transparency. So suddenly, what we had all lobbied for, inclusivity, transparency, collectivity, became exclusivity, antagonism, and information blackout. It's quite scary that even the women that are involved are not interested in putting forward the question of gender into the public discourse. Opportunities have been missed since then to put gender out into the discourse and to take the discourse away from age and political party. They've been, the thing we have never talked about, and it's something that both Rada and Elizabeth mentioned, how does armed conflict affect women? Rape has never been discussed. Abortion has never been discussed. Women as refugees have never been discussed. Widows. These issues are not part of the public discourse. And if there's one recommendation that I would like to make, and I feel we need to work on as Cyprus, but with the help of the European Women's Lobby, is to actually make more visible the research of what the effect of war is. It doesn't mean, it means soldiers dying, but it does mean a woman stuck at home having to fend for her family because everything else is falling apart. It does mean she's the front line and she's been a victim of rape, and no one talks about the rape. So that to me is very important, and is the one lesson that has come out of what has happened recently, especially with the Gender Equality Technical Committee, because in essence the information that's coming out of them is nothing. They have not approached gender experts. They have not connected in any real terms with the women organizations, or many of us that have been involved for years. So to me, if there's one message I would like to get across, and in closing to this, is that the biggest mistake that was ever made within our conflict is that the state has never embraced themselves doing seminars on conflict resolution. Never. It's never been discussed. Forgiveness, acceptance, telling the truth. This has been handled by a few NGOs, and we've been blacklisted as traitors. But to me, that would be the one message that I'd like to end with, that even though we've got a Gender Equality Committee, unless we find a way to get people more aware, more involved, and in that way lobby, they will be able to lobby to be more effective and to affect legislation, we have achieved nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. That was very engaging. Particularly your question on how does armed conflict affect women. I think that's a really crucial point, and how we can actually, as you said, make more visible the research and the effect of war, specifically on women. Yeah, so just to conclude this section, we can really see now why women's organizations in Europe have been mobilizing for peace and security. And it's still a persisting issue in Europe. As we heard it in Cyprus, women have never been at the negotiating table, and also that women need to be active in creating sustainable peace. I think those are some important messages there. I will now pass over to Pierrette for section 2, where we will hear from European and international organizations working on a feminist approach to peace and security. Thank you, Pierrette.
Thanks a lot, Una. I think it's very interesting now to talk about what a feminist approach to peace and security is, and maybe just as an introduction, I would like to remind us that conflict, war, militarism are very gendered, and usually they're based on one vision of masculinity, and this is also why so many issues are not discussed, because it's still a male world. Just some figures. To let you know that the European Union has special representatives appointed in troubled areas, and there's been only one woman out of those 10 representatives, and she was special representative for Sudan in 2010 to 13. Another interesting figure is that according to UN Women, in several countries, less than 8% of post-conflict spending was specifically budgeted to empower women and promote gender equality. So we are clearly facing a very masculine phenomenon with a very masculine vision, and this is the challenge now also of our next 3 speakers, to let us know what their vision of peace and security is from a feminist perspective. And the first person to let us know is Pauline Massard from the organization WIS, which means Women in International Security. Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierrette, and thank you very much, in fact, to the previous speakers, because they have already reinforced what I'm about to say. In fact, I don't know that there's a lot I can add. WISE was an organization founded in Washington, D.C. back in the 70s to promote more women in the fields of international relations, peace and security. WISE Brussels was founded just about a decade ago, and we have 3 principal goals. The first is to see more women in leadership roles. Pierrette, you just highlighted some very, very worrying figures, and in fact, if you take that research further and look at the number of female ambassadors and other such leading figures in European politics, it's just drastic. The second goal of WISE is to see more gender mainstreaming in foreign policy. For instance, at the moment we're working with some people in Mrs. Mogherini's team as they review the EU's security strategy, And we're trying to make sure that there is a strong gender element to whatever thinking process is going to be had before a new strategy is produced next spring. And the third element, and again, this is really just reinforcing what was said by the earlier speakers, these real practitioners on the ground, is we want to see more gender equality at the negotiating table. And when I say negotiating table, it's not just, of course, the negotiation table, it's every stage from conflict prevention to conflict resolution, negotiations, implementation of agreements, but also in reform and democratization processes, security sector reform, and so on and so forth. That just can't be stressed enough how important that is. Our activities are threefold. The first is what we call our policy activities, where we showcase more women in the policy debates. I think anybody who's been around Brussels for more than, let's say, a week has seen that debates are overwhelmingly dominated by old white men. And it's not enough to talk about gender equality, we have to do gender equality. So we work on putting women, young, old, senior, junior, in central and important policy debates, from anything ranging from the Ukraine crisis to the refugee crisis to any other conflict or international security debates that are going on at the moment. Our second branch of activities is mentoring and coaching. Coaching, we have these happy hours with senior people, senior women who tell us how to navigate the sea that is international relations and security. And we are just at the moment launching a one-to-one mentoring program, which is not just for the very young women looking to get into the security sector, but also for mid-level career women who are wondering what next steps to take. And what we hope to achieve is, of course, within 5, 10, 15, perhaps 20 years, to really reach gender equality across the board in leadership. And the third activity, which is extremely important, as I have no need, I'm sure, to tell you, is networking. We have regular happy hours where we bring in women and men practitioners from all sectors of international security and defense, be they industry, be they institutions, think tanks, academics, journalists, and so on and so forth. And the idea is really to get an informal discussion going there. I was asked today to present a feminist vision of peace and security. And I'll ask for your forgiveness for putting the word feminist in inverted commas. And the reason I did is that I feel we should stop talking about a feminist vision, but rather about a global humanist vision of peace and security. Women make up 50%, if not more, of the population. I think Liz, Rada, and Magda have all very, very clearly highlighted why women need to be part of the peace process and need to be part of the conversation. So I'm not sure we need to be talking about a feminist vision anymore. We need to be a bit more comprehensive, I think. All I want to talk about very quickly is how WISE works internally and how we hope women can work in the security sector. My first keyword will be partnerships, and I think today's webinar is a perfect example of this. European Women's Lobby bringing together several representatives from very varied organizations around Europe and beyond is a typical example of partnerships to reach a common goal. And I think it's not only women who do it, but I think women have a less competitive way of doing it and a much more collaborative way of doing it, which is a lovely segue into my second point, which is collaborative leadership. Something that doesn't necessarily come naturally even to women. But I think there is a recognition, and WISE is very strong in pushing this forward, that we need to work together and go beyond the individual to make sure that we reach, again, a common goal. Again, not something that comes naturally, something that needs to be worked on. And I think certain women, perhaps having been shunned from power for so long, have managed to be less competitive and thus more open to collaboration. And the final word really is mutual support. And again, I think today's webinar and this European Women's Lobby series is a beautiful example of it. Supporting each other as we go forward. And this is really where WISE's networking activities come into play. Be it supporting each other through projects, through informal coaching or informal networking, and exchanging information in both formal and informal manners is the way to go if we want to ultimately reach our common goal of gender equality. I think the lesson, if I'm to give one that's to be taken away, is, well, security is in the masses, in the female masses. Thank you.
Pauline, and thanks for those inspiring and words and urging women's organizations and activists to continue to organize, to mobilize, and to cooperate. This is really inspiring also because this is what we're trying to do with this webinar. So it's nice to hear from you that this is working and that we're going to add another step into this building of a feminist approach to peace and security. Before I give the floor to Stephanie, I'd just like to make a quote, to give you a quote from a military person, Mr. Patrick Camert. He said that it's perhaps more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier in armed conflict. And clearly that refers to the situation that many women and girls face in armed conflict, meaning male violence against women. And now we're going to hear from Stephanie Johansen, who works at the Global Justice Center, because what she's working on has a link to this horrible, pervasive violation of women's rights in conflict, namely rape. But the organization is proposing a very dynamic campaign to make sure that women's human rights are protected. So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Pierrette, and thank you to the European Women's Lobby for all of their support and hosting this webinar. As Pierrette just mentioned, I'm going to speak a bit today about the medical rights of women under international humanitarian law. So we're an organization focusing on the implementation of humanitarian law and human rights law from a gender perspective. And that, I think, from all the panelists we heard today, is still failed many times, and especially in the humanitarian and medical response to rape victims in conflict. Over the past year, as Radha has pointed out earlier, we've seen some increasing focus on sexual violence, and there have been some developments. If you look, for instance, at international criminal law, which responded to the atrocities in Rwanda or former Yugoslavia. However, and that's the project we are focusing on right now, we need to ensure that victims of rape receive their full rights in the humanitarian response, and we have existing very strong legal frameworks. We have the Geneva Conventions and others, and the problem is that, again, they're interpreted gender blind by what earlier was mentioned, older white men, and we need to ensure that the Geneva Conventions and other law treaties are interpreted in a way that suffices today's women's rights standards. Women's rights to medical standard, including abortion, are covered by a number of treaties, both in international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In the interest of time, as mentioned, I'll focus solely on the Geneva Conventions. So our project started out in 2011 when we published a legal brief on the right to non-discriminatory medical care for women and girls raped in armed conflict, with a focus on abortion services that marked the beginning of our campaign, focusing on two objectives. First, have abortion recognized as necessary non-discriminatory medical care under humanitarian law, and second, because laws and papers can only do so much, ensure that the option of abortion is included as part of medical care for rape victims in humanitarian settings. We're a US-based organization, and what initiated this campaign are current abortion restrictions by the United States on all of their humanitarian aid, with no exception for cases of rape, incest, or even life-threatening pregnancies. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, we've heard abortion mentioned a couple of times. This is a huge problem for rape victims in conflict who in general have little access to medical care, especially lack access to emergency contraception. So abortion is one of the medical treatments that we say needs to be included in the response. The U.S. restrictions unfortunately persist, despite growing recognition that abortion can be part of medical care under international humanitarian law. We saw France and the U.K. take leadership over the past 2 years. They have explicitly affirmed this, as well as important bodies we work with, such as the Security Council. It was this legal argument was supported in reports by the Secretary General. The European Commission, which might be of interest to our listeners especially, did the right thing 2 weeks ago and showed political leadership, affirming that, yes, international humanitarian law may justify providing an abortion if the medical condition of the women requires it. And what we see again and again is from studies that came out, for instance, a couple of months ago, is that in humanitarian settings, there's a general lack for funding for reproductive care. And abortion is the first thing that falls off the wagon if it's not explicitly mentioned and affirmed. And so if we look at international humanitarian law, there we have the common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and it says the wounded and sick in war are entitled to all necessary medical care required by their condition without adverse distinction. And this is actually a very strong non-discrimination mandate in international humanitarian law, which people forget often to emphasize in their humanitarian response. So adverse distinction, it basically means that there may be no distinction made other than the medical one. So you can't discriminate against war victims based on race or religion or sex, which in this case would be discriminating against women solely because of their biological differences, because as we know, women are the only ones who need these kind of services. You have, of course, a large number of male rape victims. That is something that is still not talked about sufficiently, and there's a general lack of information, even more than with women, but there's definitely the biological differences of men and women that have to be founded in that humanitarian response. What is also maybe important to note, because that is a question that often comes up, what we're talking about is not a right to abortion under the Geneva Conventions, but rather the rights of female war victims under international humanitarian law to be provided all of the medical care required by their condition. And lastly, and that's the last slide, is that we're often asked, why are you focusing only on the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law? So once we have an armed conflict, international humanitarian law trumps national laws and supersedes national laws. And this is quite important because, of course, if we look at national legislation, which we heard earlier in Ireland, for instance, a lot of these national abortion laws are restrictions, even though a lot of them have an exception for rape or when the life of the woman or girl is endangered. And so it's important to point out to humanitarian aid providers and parties that international humanitarian law is a universal standard of care and women and girls should be accorded their full rights under international humanitarian law. So you have a strong non-discrimination mandate and the universal obligations on states, because the Geneva Conventions are almost ratified by every country, including their additional protocols. So that is something that we push for, a gender-inclusive interpretation of the Geneva Conventions. And I'll stop right here to allow some time for other panelists maybe to jump in or to respond to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's very important for us to have you in this panel because it also shows how we've been collaborating across the ocean and how the issue of women in armed conflict is not only about the horrible things that can happen to women, but also the consequences and the long-term vision about making sure that women can recover and that their health, but that also has to do with the access to resources are guaranteed. I just want to use the opportunity to mention to everyone that we've done a fact sheet about women and armed conflict as part of our Beijing+20 report, which is called From Words to Action, because we clearly believe, and it reflects a bit what Pauline was saying about not talking about gender equality, but doing it. We want actions now, and so I encourage everyone to look at the report, which highlights key challenges, but also gives a lot of recommendations, concrete recommendations for action. And that also leads me to talk about WILF, which is the Women International League for Peace and Freedom. And before I give the floor to Maria, first of all, I want to thank WILF for their contribution to this fact sheet of our report, because they are amongst our experts, having been working for more than 100 years on the issue of peace. And before Maria presents WILF and her work, we would like to share with you a video clip which is called You Get What You Pay For, which gives another perspective into our discussion because it's about military spending. So now you will see this video clip. It's a really short one. I hope you'll enjoy it. Okay, we have the impression that the quality of the clip is not the best one. Yes, okay. I think we will stop because we really want to give tribute to this clip and we don't want to destroy it through this webinar technology. So I give the floor to Maria, and maybe Maria, you want to tell us a little bit about what the content of the clip was and the vision of WILF about security and peace.
Thank you very much. It's a pity that we couldn't watch the video, but I tried to explain a little bit what the objective of this campaign was for WILF, and you know what the logic behind it is. And basically at WILF, we are trying to move from talking about national security or militaristic security to talking about the human security. And this links very well with what we were talking about earlier about this feminist approach to peace and security. I do believe human security is, as I will explain later, what gender-sensitive approach to security would be. So basically what we were doing at this campaign, You Get What You Pay For, is that we were comparing the figures that are spent in the military sector. For example, the latest in 2013, latest figure was 1.747 trillion USD dollars that are spent internationally, globally, in armament and in the armament industry and in the security industry, or what they call security industry. And this is something in which we are comparing these figures with the figures of what is spent in education, what is spent in health. And very often we can come and say, and this was part of the video, where we are showing, you know, this money could go to that instead. And some people will be tempted to say, well, is it that easy? Can we really just take the money from one thing and put it on the other? And the answer is yes and no. I mean, no, it's not that easy. Of course, it would need a lot of transformation of many industries, transformation of our economies and our societies. But at some point, yes, it is kind of that easy that I will explain how the money that is spent on security is not actually securing us as well as we are told. So it wouldn't be that utopic to think that we wouldn't have the military security, because we are not as well protected by the military as we are told. When WILF was founded, I wanted to just give a very brief introduction to WILF, because this year we are becoming 100 years old. What we found is that we were founded by women from different sides of the First World War, in the middle of the First World War. And this war was a war that was very much about defending national interest and defending national economic interest, you know, in the new industrialized economies. And this was really an economy, a war in which the economies were using the armament and using the armament industry to evolve themselves, or to somehow thinking that these were developing their economies. And that was also somehow triggering the conflict itself. The conflict was was there in potentially for a while because these economies were they had this race in their armament that they thought was contributing to their economy. And today it is a little bit the same. We think very often that we are investing in security, but we really have to ask ourselves, are we investing in our security, or are we investing in the wrong model of security? And when we think about the military security, so you think about someone in your, you know, having, for example, an army or soldiers that are around your street when you're in the middle of a conflict. I mean, if you take the example of countries, most conflicts in countries in conflict, like we were mentioning before, that where women are being raped, and very often women are being raped by the soldiers, what is not really to their advantage on the security to see that there's a soldier in front of their door that has a gun, so has the power to rape them with impunity, because also they are subject to a justice that is different to the common justice. So this is the concept of military security, of the national security that we are seeing today. It's a security that is linked somehow to securing the institutions and not to securing the people. And then on the other hand, you have the human security, which for me could be a gender-sensitive way of seeing security, in which we could really think about the person being secure might be translated into having a shelter. It might be translated into having education services. It might be translated into being able to have lights on the streets where, you know, they could see the faces of the people around, and if someone was going to do something to them, they could recognize that person afterwards and take them to justice. I mean, these expenses, many times, this money or budget is not available because it is being spent in arming the country. Countries like India are increasingly arming themselves, thinking also it's part of their economic development. And this is very dangerous also because the money spent in the arming industry, it is to the benefit of a few, first of all, who are owning the enterprises that are building those guns or that armament, but it's also to the benefit mainly of men, because they are the ones that are part of the militaristic model. So we really have to be thinking in moving from a military security to a human security. Is not something that would be done from one day to another, but it's really something that would be linked to the security of people, and it wouldn't be linked directly to the security of just this institution or this government. And this is basically why the more than 1,000 women that gathered in The Hague 100 years ago and funded WILF, they were thinking, we need peace, and we need to end First World War, but we also need social justice, because providing those services and providing this economical justice for the people will have a long-lasting peace. This is the only thing that will ensure a long-lasting peace. And we know that was not the case, and we know we've had many, many more wars ever since. So this is still what we are saying today, is that we need a peace in which we have really social justice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Maria. This is very important to also to have amongst our membership an organization who's been there for so many years with so much experience. What you said also reminds me of the work you've been doing on small arms, and just talking about the reality of arms in so many countries where arms are available and it's legal to have arms. That also is a clear threat to women's security and human security. We have now Bori, who is with us, Bola Juhas. She's our vice president, and she's from the Hungarian Women's Lobby. And it was very important for us to ask her to come and join this webinar, because we want this webinar to be linked to what's going on currently in Europe and everybody is aware of the so-called refugee crisis. And Bori, being from Hungary and being in contact with the other Eastern Europe countries, has a lot to tell us that's completely related to women and armed conflict. So Bori, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful webinar on the International Day of Peace. And yes, I was invited to connect what has been said in this webinar to things that are going on in Hungary, in Croatia, in Serbia, and elsewhere in Europe. I would like to give you a short summary of the events from a Hungarian feminist NGO point of view. To put you into the context. And then my main message actually for the decision makers would be that the gender sensitive and feminist approach is available and please use it. And I'm trying to prove my statement. So in Hungary, as in most of the East Central European countries, we haven't seen any refugees except for the South Slavic wars a few years back. But after that, nothing. We saw the terrible footage on television of refugees dying in the Mediterranean Sea, but we did not have any first-hand experience with the refugees. In about May, the Hungarian government launched a so-called public consultation on paper with the taxpayers about the migrant issue. Migrants were not an issue yet at that point, which was basically directed against migrants. It's a very important linguistic footnote that the Hungarian government and the national media consequently only uses the word migrant and economic migrant, and they never use the word refugee. Then it was followed by a big campaign on billboards that was also directed against possible migrants. This happened at a stage when there were no migrants coming to Hungary at all. But maybe it was based on intelligence service information, I do not know, but a few weeks later, refugees started arriving to Hungary from Serbia over the fields, over the so-called green border, from 200 refugees a day to about 9,000 refugees, that was last weekend, arriving on this so-called green border. At the same time, the Hungarian government started building a fence on the Hungarian and Serbian border. Now it's being also built on the Croatian and Hungarian border. These are migrants, refugees who are coming through Greece from through Macedonia and Serbia, and now they are also in Croatia and Slovenia, and their main goal is to reach Germany or Sweden. And whatever happened since August, I think it's widely on CNN or Sky News, you can see daily footage of what is going on. The NGOs and just civilian volunteers who help these refugees in Hungary had a huge importance, because the legal route would have been for these refugees to launch, to seek for asylum, and then they would have been taken into the 3 existing open camps in Hungary. This has been existing for a decade now. But most of them decided not to enter these camps because they were waiting for the traffickers to take them over to Germany. So a very strange situation evolved in Budapest, in the capital, around the 3 main railway stations, the Eastern Railway Station, Southern, and the Western Railway Station, that the refugees were camping there. And for 2 months, they were without any kind of help given to them, water or toilets, because they should have reported at the open camps. That was what the government said. So except for August, when also the big aid NGOs and the church also came in, it was totally new civilian people who have these refugees get water and food. Apart from the physical needs of women, because approximately only every 10th is a woman of these refugees, and they usually come with their families, a lot of children as well. There are the obvious physical needs of the women. About 12% of them are pregnant. Some give birth on the road. One gave birth at the Eastern Railway Station, then she was taken to a hospital. Some have miscarriage during the day. Of course, they have periods. Some of them are nursing, and because the lack of water, that they just cannot have enough water on this several mile, transport or walk. Their kidney is failing or their milk is gone, so they cannot nurse their baby. There's also the physical threat of rape, which is reportedly being done either by the traffickers themselves, sometimes even the police, or especially if they are alone without a family male member, then by other fellow refugee men. All of these things are very nicely summarized by the European Women's Lobby's brand fresh new paper, Asylum is Not Gender Neutral, that was just published this afternoon. Please visit it, it's very important. So these are the physical realities of the refugee women. And my recommendation would be that if the so-called hotspots, whatever they will be and wherever they will be, that the EU now is thinking of putting up for the refugees fleeing from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq. These are the three countries that most of the refugees through the Balkan route are coming now. They should keep in mind the special needs of women, and maybe they should involve, when they are designing these hotspots, the recommendations of women organizations or the women themselves in these camps. I think it's very important when the EU negotiations are going on either on this or on the whole Syrian situation. And we wish we would at a time when already peace negotiations are going on. Right now, it's not yet peace negotiations are going on about Syria. It would be very important that these decision makers know that there are standardized procedures which are gender sensitive. For instance, the UNHCR gender guidelines from 2002, but also there are some countries who issued very gender sensitive best practices and guidelines how to tackle the problems of women refugees when they are handing in the asylum, like from the question of the gender of the interviewer, or whether these women are listened to individually during this asylum interview, or only the head of the household, the man of the family, is interviewed, as many countries have totally different procedures for these asylum investigations. So this knowledge is available, but it's not always used, and I think it would be very, very important to be aware of these standardized procedures. And finally, I would like to repeat why feminism is important in the refugee question, and why actually everything that my panelists, colleagues and sisters have said could be used by the decision makers, and it's a great asset that we all accumulated. Because not all women are feminists. Probably the most well-known Hungarian woman today is Miss Petra László, who is a camera person, who probably you have seen the footage that she kicked the 80-year-old girl, a refugee girl, over the border 2 weeks ago, and also kicked the man with with his son in his hands, and she became a symbol of xenophobia and hatred. And although the Hungarian Women's Lobby are member organizations and the European Women's Lobby, we were always thinking that it's a humanitarian question, and feminism is part of humanism, and we should open our hearts and borders for the refugees, and they are fleeing conflicts. But we shouldn't forget that some other women NGOs issued statements in Hungary against migrants. So unless we use a kind of feminist approach, we will not really get to peace. And I would like to draw the attention to a very harrowing thing that I, as a gender expert, also seen in the Hungarian media. that women are used as a tool in the rhetorics. For instance, the Hungarian national media forbade pictures showing children and women, whereas if you see international news, all you see is pictures of very moving pictures of women, pregnant women, children. And the Hungarian media is usually showing men, young individual men. Yes, it's true that 80% of the refugees are individual men. Some of them are sent forward by their families to find a safe place and then invite the rest of the family or send money home. But there are other women as well. And in the right-wing media, a very important message was spread, and now it's held by actually a lot of Hungarians, that the migrants will rape Hungarian girls and women, whereas we know that it's actually the refugee women and girls who are raped, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So we should really put a stop to using women in rhetorics for xenophobic purposes.
Thank you so much, Boris. Sorry, we are approaching the end of the webinar, but your intervention was very important because you mentioned so many different aspects, and especially you helped, I hope, a lot of people to understand that when we talk about wars and refugees, it's not homogeneous groups, that they are women and that they are treated differently, that they experience different forms of violence and situations that are because of the gender and also the role of the media. It's very important to have that perspective, and as you said, we just published an article today, so please look at our website to read it. I also just wanted to say that the video clip of WILF is also available on our Twitter. So just use the hashtag Beijing+20, which was the hashtag of this webinar. We have a lot of different tweets from different people following us. Thank you to all the followers for that. And now, to conclude, I would like to give the floor to each of you for 1 minute. And I was watching the Twitter, the hashtag Beijing+20, and I saw that today, because it's the Peace Day, Ban Ki-moon, so the UN Secretary General, he did ring the peace bell, and I quote, to continue until we realize the vision of the Charter. So I would like to ask you in 1 minute, what would be your recommendation to transform these nice words into action? And I will start by asking Elizabeth. Radha had to leave us earlier, so she's not there anymore. But Elizabeth, in 1 minute, can you tell us what would you like to conclude with?
Hello, that's a challenge to achieve the vision of the Charter. So I'll say something slightly different about the really important things that will work towards that. And just noting Magda saying there was no choice but to mobilise. And the words of our Women Co-project around collaboration and cooperation and so on have all been used a great deal today. And we've seen how absent women are from the negotiations, from the peace, though they were very present and very suffered and experienced during the various conflicts that we've considered. So the imperative to make sure that women's voices are there, and there's nobody else getting them there, it seems, except us in our collective and comprehensive attempts to do that. So it's only encouragement to us all to continue what we're doing and try and get women's voices and get women's needs recognised, and make sure that women are at the heart of our peace building and for security and safety for women.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for this very strong and optimistic message also. Magda, it's your turn. In 1 minute, what would you like to say to us, to Ban Ki-moon, to whoever you want?
I will continue. Elizabeth's collaboration is imperative, but I will take it one step further. And if we want the future to be any more positive, we need to do more educational programs for girls and boys to foster a culture of peace, to look at conflict resolution by non-violent means, and to promote tolerance. And this needs to be done at a state level. It cannot be carried by NGO level, because NGO is marginalized. So we need to find a way that our the younger generation does not repeat our mistakes. So we need to have encourage and nurture and teach a culture of peace, but officially it mustn't be marginalized. Our kids deserve a better future. Our kids deserve a positive future, and the only way we'll do that is if we have educational programs throughout the world, wherever we can, that foster a culture of peace and resolving conflict without violence. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's very strong also. And indeed, we didn't talk about also the impact of armed conflict on young people, especially on young girls, and also for their building up in this situation. Now, Stephanie, I'll give you the floor because Pauline also had to go. But so, Stephanie, what's your minute of recommendation?
Thank you, Pierrette. So our president, she often uses the quote, which of course is oversimplifying things, that women get policies and men get the law. So I want to conclude today with the appeal to really aggressively enforce international humanitarian law and human rights law, so it suffices women's needs, especially in conflict settings, because we see again the Geneva Conventions were drafted at a time where you had the focus on men, not so much on women, and so we really need to take it to another level and ensure that with rape being used as a tactic of war, women are accorded their full rights under the Geneva Conventions and other international humanitarian law. Thank you.
That's also very concrete. We need that. Thank you. Now, Maria, what is your minute of recommendation?
Thank you. Since I was having this economic approach that I was talking about earlier, I think I will continue with that. And Magda earlier, she was saying we have to look into what is the cost for women of conflict. And I will say, you know, we also have to be thinking in who does conflict benefit. If I take the example of our colleague from DRC who was here right now last week, we can see in DRC how women are being raped and what is the benefit of that conflict. And it goes to many companies who are coming in and extracting minerals. So I think we have to think into the economy of conflict and thinking who's benefiting from it, and the cost of it is unfortunately very often for women.
Again, I engage everybody to really watch the video clip of Wilf, because that gives a lot of insight into this area that we rarely talk about, so that's very important. And finally, the last minute of recommendations, Bori.
Thank you. I would like to go back to what Stephanie Johansson said in my summary, and I think both policy and law is needed, which is gender sensitive, and this should be used. And this webinar convinced me that the knowledge is there, even in policies and also in laws. So this should be taught to helpers, aid workers, officials, lawmakers, that there are existing best practices, policies and laws, and they should be used. That's my recommendation to the EU officials now, and ministers and the European Council. They are meeting almost every day now to solve the so-called refugee crisis.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. We are now reaching the end of this webinar, and I think it was very, very rich in terms of knowing better what's going on in Europe, hearing from the mobilization of women's organization, getting a lot of recommendations about what a feminist approach to peace and security is about. I'd like to thank a lot all the speakers, all our members and partners who took time to come to join us for this from this webinar. Thanks a lot for your expertise and for your passion. I would like to also thank the members of the European Women's Lobby who've been feeding into the report, Beijing+20, and who've been giving us this vision about a feminist approach to security and vision. I would like to thank the team of the EWL at the Secretariat for the support in organizing this. And we had also today Elvira, our communication officer, she was following and tweeting. And a very, very special thank to Una, who was coordinating the webinar, organizing it. She was in contact with all of you, and she made an amazing work, and this made the success of this webinar. So thank you, everybody. Now we will cut the recording, but you will find the webinar on our website today or tomorrow, and we keep in touch for any future action to bring feminist vision of peace and security. Have a nice day. Bye.